Beyond the reach of paved ambition, where the earth remembers older names, lies Cold Creek, a valley draped in a stillness so profound it feels less like air and more like memory. Here the Carver lineage, a dwindling echo, has long inhabited a truth too heavy for words, a quiet torment woven into the very warp and weft of their existence. The air itself often carried the faint, sweet decay of forgotten iron, a metallic tang that spoke of things long buried. Their ancestral home, a gaunt sentinel against the unending sky, leaned with the resignation of something that has seen too much. Every warped timber, every peeling patch of paint, whispered of generations who had endured, not lived. This house, the Carvers knew, was not merely built upon land. It was rooted in a secret, a legacy they carried like a genetic burden, visible only to their own bloodline, a haunting inheritance passed down through silent glances and unspoken fears. Within its seldom-used parlor, a large, oil-painted portrait of an ancient Carver matriarch presided over the dust. Her eyes, dark pools of quiet judgment, had always seemed to follow those who entered. A trick of the light, but lately, her gaze felt different, burdened, as if the canvas itself had absorbed a silent grief, a subtle shift that could be dismissed as fading varnish or simply the mind playing tricks in the encroaching gloom. The silence in the house, a constant companion, had begun to deepen. It was not merely the absence of sound, but an oppressive void, a silence that swallowed whispers, where the tick of a clock seemed to echo from an impossible distance, then vanish entirely. A hollow space that felt not empty, but profoundly, terrifyingly full, resonating with a sound that wasn't there. The old grandfather clock in the hall, a steadfast sentinel of time, began to falter. Its steady, reassuring rhythm would abruptly stutter, then pause, the pendulum frozen mid-swing for moments that stretched into eternity before resuming its beat as if nothing had happened. A simple mechanical failure, perhaps, yet in a house where routine was ritual, this disruption felt like a tear in the fabric of their quiet torment. Even the light, once dependable, seemed to lose its power. Rooms that had known the bright wash of morning now harbored persistent shadows, corners refusing to yield to the sun's embrace. It was as if the land itself, ancient and weary, was beginning to pull the light back into its dark embrace, a creeping twilight that hinted at a deeper, more fundamental dimming. This wasn't just old age settling into the timbers. This was a slow, deliberate unwinding, an unraveling of the very threads that bound their reality. Each failing light, each stuttering clock, each unseen flicker in a painted eye carried the weight of a silent question. What else was preparing to break, and what precisely would follow? The rhythmic heartbeat of the old Carver home, the immense grandfather clock in the main hall, began its silent, defiant protest. Its brass pendulum, a polished sentinel of generations, once swung with an unwavering cadence, marking the inexorable march of time in a valley where time itself felt suspended, heavy with an ancient stillness. But now it would simply stop. Not a gentle winding down, but an abrupt, unnerving halt, mid-swing, often at the precise moment a draft ghosted through the house, or a floorboard gave a singular, sharp creak. Grandmother Ilara, with hands gnarled from years of work and worry, her face etched with a wisdom born of quiet endurance, would sigh, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, and meticulously reset the heavy weights, her movements slow, ritualistic, only for the same cessation to occur within hours, the hands invariably frozen at a different, arbitrary number. This wasn't merely a mechanical failure. It was a deliberate disruption, a broken pattern echoing a deeper fracture within the very fabric of their existence, leaving an unsettling stillness where the reassuring tick-tock should have been. The air itself seemed to thicken around the silent sentinel, pulling their attention, demanding answers it refused to provide. Each stopped clock, a tiny death in the heart of their home. Sleep, once a fleeting respite, became another arena for the burgeoning dread. Young Lyra, barely 9, would wake in the dark, her small body trembling, not from a simple nightmare, but from a persistent, recurring vision that clawed at the edges of her memory long after dawn. Always the same, a vast, featureless plain under a sky the color of bruised plums, a landscape that stretched endlessly towards an unseen horizon, suffused with a sense of immense, unmeasurable grief, and a faint, distant whisper, sometimes a child's mournful cry, sometimes a low, guttural murmur that promised something terrible, something that crept closer with each repetition. Her parents, Daniel and Clara, dismissed it as childish fancy, but they too found their own dreams growing more vivid, more disturbing. Images of murky, stagnant water swirling with indistinct shapes, of distorted faces half hidden by shadow, their eyes hollow and accusing. A profound, unshakable chill settled deep in their bones, persistent and unwelcome. The line between waking and dreaming blurred, their subconscious minds serving as unwilling conduits for an encroaching horror that seemed to seep from the very foundations of the earth. The old nursery at the very top of the house, a forgotten space filled with dust motes dancing in sunbeams that struggled to pierce the grimy panes, began to harbor an unholy gloom. It wasn't just a lack of light, but an active absorption of it, a ravenous shadow that devoured every photon that dared enter, leaving only a pervasive twilight. The air in that room grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like old dried blood, a scent that clung to the throat and taste buds. Even on the brightest noons, a chilling penumbra clung to the corners, a stagnant, suffocating presence that pressed down on the senses, making breath shallow. To step inside was to feel a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature, a prickling on the skin, as if unseen eyes were watching from the deepening shadows, their gaze cold and assessing. The forgotten toys left abandoned, a wooden train with splintered wheels, a rocking horse with chipped paint and one missing eye, seemed to lean inward, whispering of unseen presences, of memories not their own, vibrating with a silence that screamed. The infrequent visits from the outlying homesteads, the few other families scattered across the valley's desolate expanse, began to carry a new, unsettling undertone. Not direct accusations or clear observations, but fragmented tales, whispered in hushed tones over weak, lukewarm coffee, their eyes darting nervously towards the windows. Old Silas McGregor, whose land bordered the Carver's northern fence line, spoke of his livestock growing skittish, refusing to enter certain pastures, their eyes wide with an unnameable terror, as if they sensed a predator, far more ancient than any wolf. Martha Thorne from the southern ridge swore she heard children's voices echoing from the cold creek itself, not the playful shouts of the living, but mournful, spectral cries carried on the unnaturally still air. Too clear, too sorrowful to be a trick of the wind. These weren't explicit warnings, but unsettling ambiguities, hints of a pervasive wrongness that radiated outwards from the Carver property line, a silent contagion seeping into the very land, leaving a residue of fear on every breath. The house itself seemed to remember, to breathe the memories of a sin long buried, a secret that had festered beneath generations of silence. Daniel, in the dead of night, sometimes heard the floorboards creak overhead. Not with the settling of an old house, but with the distinct, heavy tread of footsteps that ceased just as he reached the landing, a deliberate pause. Clara, while cleaning the dusty attic, stumbled upon a faint, faded sketch tucked into the brittle pages of an old family Bible. A crude drawing of a twisted, thorny symbol, unfamiliar yet deeply disturbing in its simplicity, accompanied by a single cryptic phrase scrawled beneath in an ancient, spidery hand. "The earth drinks what is owed," was a poisoned callback, a direct whisper from the past, hinting at the ancestral crime, leaving a cold residue that clung to their thoughts long after the discovery, a chill that no fire could dispel, a stain no amount of scrubbing could erase. The failing clocks became a morbid ritual, a family exclusivity in their peculiar torment, a shared burden that tightened the bonds of their quiet dread. It was no longer just the formidable grandfather clock. Smaller timepieces throughout the house, the delicate mantel clock in the parlor, the sturdy kitchen clock, even Daniel's pocket watch, a cherished heirloom, began to falter, their hands freezing at arbitrary moments, often at the cusp of dawn or the deepest, most isolated hour of night. This shared anomaly, this silent conspiracy of time against them, fostered a unique, hereditary fear, a premonition passed down through the bloodline. Each stalled clock face was a silent accusation, a physical manifestation of a debt they inherited, but could not comprehend, forcing them into a peculiar torture, watching time slip through their fingers, leaving them adrift in a temporal twilight, a fear known only to those bound to Cold Creek by the unbreakable, terrible chains of blood. Then came the disappearances of small, mundane objects, not valuable, but intimately personal. A favorite porcelain doll of Lyra's, left carefully on her windowsill, vanished without a trace. No broken glass, no sign of forced entry, just an empty space where childhood innocence had been. Daniel's well-worn work gloves, set neatly by the back door after a long day in the fields, were simply gone, leaving the faint imprint of their absence on the dusty floorboards. Clara's silver locket, always worn around her neck, was found one morning tucked beneath her pillow, open, its tiny, faded photograph of her grandmother missing. These were not thefts. They were subtractions, meticulous and unnerving, performed by an unseen hand. It felt as if the house, or something within it, was selectively consuming parts of their daily lives, erasing their presence with a chilling precision. Each missing item left a palpable void, a cold spot in the heart of the home, transforming familiar spaces into arenas of unsettling uncertainty, a subtle shadow of risk creeping into their domesticity, hinting at a more profound, more significant loss to come. The Carvers had always lived, surrounded by their ancestors, their stern, painted gazes watching from the old oil portraits that lined the main hall, their faces a gallery of forgotten struggles and silent endurance. But now, those gazes seemed to hold more than just historical record. Sometimes in the periphery of vision, when no one was looking directly, a flicker of movement would occur, a subtle shift in expression, the barest tilt of a head, or a fleeting softening of a grim painted mouth. A grimacing ancestor might seem to soften into sorrow, their painted eyes holding a depth of ancient pain, or a stoic matriarch's painted lips might subtly curve into a faint, knowing smile that chilled the blood. Yet upon direct scrutiny, they would invariably return to their original frozen states, their expressions impassive, unreadable. It was a reversible omen, a fleeting glimpse behind the veil, a whisper from beyond the canvas, leaving a lingering doubt, a sliver of terrifying possibility that their silent observers were not so silent after all, that they were perhaps still bound to the same unspeakable legacy. The unnatural gloom of the nursery wasn't merely a lack of light. It was an active, oppressive presence that seemed to pulse with a low, malevolent energy, growing heavier with each passing day. It drew them, despite their primal fear, to its threshold, a morbid curiosity compelling them to peer into its depths, to challenge the darkness. What secrets did the shadows hold? What grotesque echo of the past, what unholy remnant lay waiting within that perpetually darkened chamber? Breathing its cold air, it was a threatening curiosity, a lure that promised revelation, but threatened to consume those who dared to seek it, hinting at a truth far more terrible than they could yet imagine, a truth the room seemed to guard with a palpable, chilling force, whispering of a knowledge that could shatter the mind. And the silence, a constant companion in their isolated valley, began to take on a new, more profound character, twisting from quietude into something predatory. It wasn't merely the absence of sound, but an active, consuming void. The distant chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the ancient oak outside, the mournful call of a lone owl at dusk, all seemed muted, swallowed by an invisible maw, the sounds deadening before they reached the ears. It was a silence loop, a suffocating enclosure that pressed in on their ears, magnifying the internal anxieties, amplifying the frantic beat of their own hearts until it felt like a drum against their ribs, the only sound left in a world stripped bare. This was the true herald of their impending doom, a silence that wasn't peaceful, but profoundly malevolent, patiently waiting for the moment it could claim everything, leaving only the memory of sound in its wake, an empty stage for the terror to come. The hushed exploration for answers led Sarah to a crawl space beneath the floorboards of the study, a space long forgotten, thick with the dust of generations and the peculiar scent of something ancient and disturbed. What secrets did the earth beneath the family home still hold, patiently waiting to be unearthed by desperate hands? This room, once a quiet sanctum for Thomas, now felt like a repository of sorrows, each creaking board a lament for the lost. It was a place burdened by a very specific and inherited memory, a quiet shame passed down through the bloodline. Behind a loose stone in the fireplace hearth, Thomas's fingers found an unexpected void, a cavity filled not with ash, but with something wrapped in brittle, oil-stained canvas. A chilling curiosity compelled him to retrieve it, though every instinct screamed for him to recoil. The bundle yielded to his touch, exhaling a dry, earthy perfume mixed with the metallic tang of old blood. Inside, nestled amongst dried herbs and a small, petrified bird claw, lay a leather-bound journal, its pages the color of aged parchment, stiff and unyielding. The dense sensoriality of the moment was overwhelming, a tangible link to a forgotten past. This was no ordinary journal. Its heavy cover bore an intricately carved symbol, a serpentine knot intertwined with a severed limb, a grotesque family emblem never spoken of. It was a symbol exclusive to the Carver lineage, a mark of their distinct, terrible heritage. The mere presence of the journal shattered the fragile veneer of their desperate routine. The search for a future had unexpectedly flung them into the violent heart of their distant past, twisting their current reality into something unrecognizable. As Sarah and Thomas carefully unrolled the brittle pages, the faded ink began to speak of desperate seasons and a land dispute that spiraled into something unspeakable. Each transcribed word deepened their progressive discomfort, revealing a chilling confession of betrayal and a pact sealed not with ink, but with lifeblood. The entries detailed a brutal seizure of ancestral lands, a heinous act committed against those who dwelled there, long before the carvers arrived. The shadow of risk became palpable. They weren't just reading history. They were confronting the very genesis of their curse. The words spoke of a payment, a tithe of kin, demanded by an entity awakened by the spilled blood. After each chilling passage, an unnatural silence descended upon the study, a silence so profound it seemed to absorb the very air, leaving only the echo of ancient screams. One entry spoke of a dark rain, a crimson deluge that mirrored the one falling outside, but then described it receding, a brief reprieve. This reversible omen offered a fleeting, cruel hope that this horror too might pass, only to be crushed by the next lines describing the subsequent, inevitable disappearances. Down the hall, young Finn, Ilara's elder brother, began to change. His movements grew hesitant. His eyes, once alight with childlike wonder, now held an unsettling ambiguity, as if constantly peering into a realm unseen by others. He spoke less, but when he did, his words were peculiar, archaic, sometimes echoing phrases from the very journal Sarah and Thomas were deciphering. A threatening curiosity enveloped them. Was Finn merely grieving, or was he becoming a conduit for something far older and more malevolent? He spent hours in Ilara's empty room, though it was now just a space of absence, sketching feverishly with charcoal on scrap paper. His drawings were disturbingly accurate depictions. The room itself seemed to thicken with a dense sensoriality when Finn was there. A faint, cold mist would coalesce near the floorboards, and the scent of damp earth, distinct from the rain outside, would permeate the air. He would whisper to the emptiness, his voice soft, almost a lullaby, chillingly out of sync with his innocent age. His playtime, once filled with the joyful clatter of wooden blocks and the bright calls of make-believe, was now a broken pattern. He would sit motionless for long stretches, his small hands clasped, listening to something only he could perceive, an unseen symphony of dread. The family watched, their stomachs tightening with progressive discomfort. Each blank stare, each whispered word from Finn felt like a tightening noose. They knew he was not well, but the source of his affliction felt impossibly ancient, too vast for any human remedy. One afternoon, Finn pointed at an old portrait of a severe-looking ancestor, one of the original carvers that hung in the hallway. "He comes for the promises," Finn murmured, his voice strangely deep. The shadow of risk suddenly felt immense. Finn was not just seeing ghosts. He was interpreting the very nature of their ancient contract. Later, the old grandfather clock in the hall, which had long ceased to keep time, let out a single, sonorous chime, echoing through the sudden silence loop that followed Finn's pronouncement. A spectral punctuation mark to his unsettling words. The sound was deafening in its unexpectedness, yet it seemed to emanate from nowhere. The flickering light of the storm outside seemed to pulse in sync with the carver's escalating terror. For a moment, a pale, almost iridescent light pooled around Finn's feet, a shimmering promise of something ethereal. But it swiftly receded, a reversible omen, leaving only the oppressive gray of the dying day. The portraits on the walls, those silent witnesses to generations of carver torment, seemed to subtly shift their gaze. It was a poisoned callback to the initial sense of unease, now magnified by the chilling discoveries and Finn's disturbing link to the unseen. The house itself began to breathe, exhaling cold pockets of air that prickled the skin. The unsettling ambiguity of strange drafts turned into something more malevolent, as doors that had been firmly closed swung open with a slow, deliberate creak, revealing darkened rooms that felt like gaping mouths. What unseen force was stirring in the very timbers of their home? The threatening curiosity was unbearable, yet they dared not turn away. Every sound, every shadow, demanded their full, terrified attention. The ancestral home, which had always been a refuge, however bleak, now revealed its true nature: a cage. This feeling of family exclusivity, once a source of pride, now twisted into a deep, inescapable entrapment. The walls were not just walls. They were the hardened arteries of their curse. The sounds became a dense sensoriality that enveloped them: the rhythmic drip of stagnant water in the unused cellar, the whisper of dry leaves skittering across the attic floor like spectral footsteps, the almost imperceptible hum that vibrated through the very foundation. The steady, predictable creak of the house settling into night, a sound once comforting, was now a broken pattern. Instead, there were sudden, jarring thumps from above, inexplicable scratches against the floorboards below, a symphony of discord that spoke of something alien within. The progressive discomfort escalated with the temperature drops that swept through specific rooms, an icy embrace that felt less like cold air and more like a decaying presence. It was a chill that penetrated the bones, a reminder of the inescapable chill that had claimed the youngest Carver. A heavy tome fell from a high shelf in the library, landing with a thunderous clap that sent dust motes dancing in the dim light. The shadow of risk was no longer a distant threat. It was now a tangible, physical manifestation within their very dwelling. A porcelain doll, a cherished relic from Alara's nursery, tipped over on its shelf with a soft thud, its painted eyes seeming to stare directly at the terrified family. For a fleeting second, the air crackled with a resonant silence loop, a pause before the next inevitable horror. The light bulb in the kitchen, which had merely flickered for weeks, suddenly exploded with a sharp pop, plunging the room into immediate darkness. It was a reversible omen, suggesting destruction, yet leaving them in a deeper, more profound blackness that promised no end. If you made it this far without blowing out the candle, subscribe to The Hidden Horror. What comes next doesn't want to be seen alone. The scent of damp earth and something acrid intensified, growing unbearable. The air thickened, pressing down on them, stifling breath. Every instinct screamed for escape, but the walls seemed to lean inward, a poisoned callback to their inescapable fate. Finn, now standing motionless in the doorway of Alara's room, began to sing a chilling, wordless lullaby, a melody that resonated with the guttural sounds now emanating from the very walls. The portraits on the hall walls shuddered imperceptibly, their painted eyes seeming to follow him. The house, for a terrifying span of minutes, became a living, breathing entity of dread. A cold wind whipped through the closed windows, and the faint, distinct echoes of children's voices, not Alara's, but others, long dead, whispered from the stagnant corners. The very foundations seemed to groan under an immense, unseen pressure, as if the earth itself was trying to pull the home back into its depths. A single drop of viscous, dark liquid seeped from a crack in the ceiling, staining the wallpaper like a fresh wound. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ceased. An immediate, profound silence descended, heavier than any storm. The house was touched, and it waited. The silence that followed the house's shuddering breath had not been one of peace, but of profound, aching anticipation. It was the stillness before a great predator's pounce, a holding of breath that pressed down on the Carvers, tighter than any physical weight. Now the rain of blood, which had once been a memory, a hushed tale told behind cupped hands, began to fall not as a brief, terrifying shower, but as a weeping sky, persistent and unrelenting. Each crimson drop, not just a stain on the windowpane, but a tiny, chilling tremor against the very foundation of their existence, hinting at an approaching deluge that would drown more than just the earth. The air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and rust, became a shroud, pulling them deeper into a chill that no fire could dispel, a cold born from the earth's ancient despair. This wasn't merely a return. It was a deepening, a settling in, a claim staked with renewed, terrifying conviction. They tried to deny it, to rationalize the spreading stains on the porch as something other than the sky's grotesque offering. They scrubbed furiously until their hands were raw and trembling, attempting to impose a semblance of order upon chaos, a futile ritual against an encroaching tide. The daily routines, once a fragile shield against the encroaching dread, now fractured under the weight of the crimson rain. Morning coffee grew cold, untouched. Meals remained uneaten as shadows lengthened, stretching from corners that defied the light. The familiar creak of the floorboards no longer offered comfort, but a warning. Each groan a premonition of collapse. The very act of living, once an unconscious rhythm, became a forced, desperate performance, played out against the backdrop of a world bleeding, a pattern irrevocably broken. Beyond the strained facade of their home, the valley itself began to writhe under an invisible duress. A sickly sweet odor like overripe fruit mixed with the metallic tang of old blood now clung to the air, seeping through closed windows and locked doors. The cold creek, already unnaturally dark, thickened to an opaque, viscous flow, its surface swirling with an iridescent sheen that mirrored no natural light. The rustling of leaves in the ancient forest that ringed their property no longer sounded like the wind, but like 1,000 tiny claws dragging across rough stone, a whisper of countless unseen things stirring awake. The earth, once solid beneath their feet, seemed to hum with a low, resonant vibration, a pulse that resonated not with life, but with an immense, patient hunger. It began with a whisper, then a fleeting glimpse, a shadow too quick for the eye, too precise for chance. The youngest carver, the one the rain had claimed, began to manifest not as a spectral form, but as an undeniable impression, a profound and agonizing absence made horribly present. A child's half-finished drawing found on a table where no one had left it. The faint, sweet scent of a particular soap lingering in a room long vacant. The almost imperceptible echo of a small, joyful laugh caught in the draft of a closing door. Each instance was a tendril of icy fear, a subtle yet devastating reminder that what was taken had not simply vanished, but had merged with the fabric of their horror, leaving behind a chilling trail of breadcrumbs, beckoning them closer to a truth they dared not name. What intricate, ghastly blueprint guided these ephemeral visitations? Their desperate attempts to flee, to sever the tether that bound them to Cold Creek, met with an unseen, unyielding resistance. The old Ford, sputtering to life with newfound reluctance, would mysteriously stall just beyond the valley's rim, its engine dying with a sigh, as if the land itself exhaled a final possessive breath. Roads that were once familiar now seemed to twist and contort, leading them back to their crumbling doorstep, a mocking labyrinth fashioned from the very soil. Even the simple act of packing became an ordeal. Hands would tremble uncontrollably. Objects would slip from their grasp, as if an unseen force actively sabotaged their every effort. Each failed attempt was not merely a setback, but a reaffirmation of their imprisonment, a growing awareness that the valley was not just a place, but a living, malevolent entity, its grip tightening around their very will. The shadow of an inescapable risk now stretched across every horizon. The horror, once diffuse, began to sharpen its focus, twisting itself around the most intimate and cherished memories of the Carver lineage. The old daguerreotypes in the drawing room, once cherished relics of a forgotten past, seemed to shift, their faded eyes now holding a knowing, cruel glint. Eleanor, the family matriarch, found herself standing before a cracked mirror, not seeing her own reflection, but a fleeting glimpse of a distant ancestor, their face contorted in a silent scream. The heavy scent of dried roses, a fragrance unique to their great-grandmother's bridal gown, would suddenly fill the musty air of the attic, only to vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a chilling vacuum. This torment was not generic, it was profoundly personal, woven into the very fabric of their bloodline, a haunting tailored exclusively for the Carvers, leveraging their shared history against them. A thick, viscous substance, the color of dried pomegranate, began to seep from the very walls in the elder Carver's study, leaving behind a trail that resembled ancient script. It wasn't random. It formed patterns, lines that converged and diverged, echoing the lines on the family's cracked and yellowed land deeds. Yet, the meaning remained just beyond their grasp, a language of suffering they were on the cusp of understanding, but could not quite decipher. One night, the old grandfather clock in the hall, long since silent, chimed 13 times, its heavy pendulum swinging with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. Each clang echoing with a profound and unsettling finality that should not have been possible. The phenomenon was undeniably real, tangible, yet its message was maddeningly obscure. A clear event shrouded in unsettling ambiguity. The sky above Cold Creek no longer merely wept blood. It exhaled it, a slow, viscous descent that coated everything in a glistening crimson film. The chickens in the coop lay still, their feathers matted and stiff with the sanguine rain, their eyes staring blankly at a sky that had become their killer. The few remaining cattle, once placid grazers, huddled together, their low moans a continuous lament, their breath steaming in the strangely warm, humid air. This wasn't a punishment. It was a collection, a payment rendered in kind, the valley demanding its due. The rain of blood, once a singular, horrifying event, was now a poisoned callback, an active, malicious recall of the curse, gathering what it was owed, piece by terrifying piece, echoing the ancient sin in every drop. Then came the quiet. Not the comforting quiet of a world at rest, but a profound, unnatural stillness that swallowed sound whole. The mournful call of the lone bird, once a melancholic backdrop, ceased entirely. The creak of unseen beams, the distant sigh of the wind through the pines, all were gone. It was as if the valley itself had held its breath, waiting. This wasn't a pause. It was a deeper immersion, a new phase of the torment, where the absence of noise was more terrifying than any cacophony. The very air felt thick and heavy, pressing down, suffocating them with its profound emptiness, leaving only the frantic drum of their own hearts to break the silence. This was the true silence loop, a trap woven from the absence of sensation, designed to amplify their internal terror. It was in this suffocating quiet that the presence of the youngest Carver became undeniable, a chilling, almost corporeal weight in the house. He wasn't just remembered, he was felt. His tiny handprint, miraculously clear in the blood film on a window pane, seemed to shimmer as if still wet. A child's drawing, scrawled hastily in crayon, depicting stick figures beneath a red sun, appeared tucked beneath Eleanor's pillow, a drawing that hadn't existed moments before. It was a tangible, agonizing connection, a message from beyond the veil. This presence, once a source of overwhelming grief, now felt less like a memory and more like a demand, a chilling confirmation that the cycle was not broken, but merely shifting its form, a reversible omen that now felt irreversibly binding. The threads, once scattered and disparate, began to weave themselves into a tapestry of absolute dread. What had been fragmented whispers now formed a chilling chorus, revealing the unholy union of a forgotten name and a primal hunger. The carvings on the ancient hearth, dismissed for generations as crude pioneer art, revealed themselves to be sigils of a terrible pact, etched not in stone, but in blood and sacrifice. Each flickering shadow, each sudden drop in temperature, was not a random anomaly, but a signature, a slow, deliberate tightening of the ancestral knot. The Carver family, for all their willful blindness, could no longer deny the precise geometry of their inherited torment. The child, little Ilara, became less a victim and more a conduit, her small hand tracing patterns on frosted windows that mirrored the symbols of the old pact. Her innocent voice, once soft and melodic, began to carry the unnerving cadence of forgotten tongues, reciting names that made the very air around her grow cold. This was not the sickness of a child. It was the chilling, unwavering focus of an instrument tuned to a frequency beyond mortal hearing. The family watched, paralyzed, as her eyes, once brimming with youthful light, held the ancient, knowing depth of the generations past. Outside the fractured panes of the parlor, the world itself began to unravel. The sky, which had once painted Cold Creek with hues of fading sunlight, now hung heavy, an oppressive canvas of bruised violet and sickly ochre. No bird sang, no breeze stirred the brittle branches. The silence that had always been a feature of the valley now pressed in, absolute and suffocating. A silence that consumed sound and perhaps even thought. Even the distant hum of power lines, the last tenuous link to the outside world, had ceased. The radio, once a source of mundane distraction, emitted only a ceaseless hiss, punctuated by a low, guttural thrum that seemed to vibrate from the very foundations of the earth. It was not static. It was a pulse, a slow, rhythmic beat that synchronized with the unnatural throbbing of the creek outside. The water, once merely dark, now mirrored the sky's diseased color, flowing sluggishly with an impossible thickness, as if carrying the weight of centuries of despair. This was no longer a terrestrial waterway. It was a vein pumped by an unseen, monstrous heart beneath the soil. Old man Silas, the patriarch, his face etched with the weariness of 1,000 cold dawns, finally understood the full horror of his lineage. The diary, rediscovered in the forgotten crawlspace beneath the rotting floorboards of the root cellar, spoke not of a land dispute, but of a calculated, ritualistic offering, a pact with something ancient and ravenous to secure the fertile soil of Cold Creek. It was not a plea for survival. It was a bargain for power, paid in the lifeblood of the innocent. The names, once whispered as curses, were now understood as keys. He knew what had to be done. The cycle demanded a payment, a final atonement. His ancestors had believed they could outwit the hunger, offering just enough to satiate it, generation after generation. But the hunger had grown, insatiable, intelligent, claiming more with each blood rain. He gathered the last remaining carvers in the main hall, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight, the glow inadequate against the encroaching darkness. A cold draft snaked through the room, though every window was sealed shut. He spoke, his voice raspy, of breaking the cycle, of ending the debt once and for all. He spoke of a ritual found deep within the obscured pages of the diary, a final, desperate act to sever the ties that bound them to the ancient entity. The price, he warned, would be absolute. It was not a plea, but a grim statement of fact, a reckoning that had been waiting for centuries. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch, their eyes dark pools reflecting the dying light. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and ozone, a premonition of the earth tearing itself open. Outside, a low keening sound began to rise, a sound that was not wind, but the vocalization of something immense awakening beneath the soil. The house itself groaned, its ancient timbers shifting, not from decay, but from an external pressure, an embrace that was slowly crushing it. The faint echoes of children's voices, once a vague discomfort, now coalesced into a clear, anguished chorus, a mournful lament from those already taken. Silas, with a terrible resolve, walked towards the center of the room. He held a small, tarnished silver dagger, its blade dull with age, yet shimmering with an unnatural gleam in the fading light. This was the instrument of the original betrayal, and now he hoped of their salvation. He understood that the entity craved not just blood, but the profound emotional resonance of sacrifice, the breaking of a spirit. He raised the dagger, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, where the timbers were beginning to splinter with audible cracks. His last words were not a prayer, but a defiance, a challenge thrown into the maw of eternity. A sudden, violent tremor shook the house, knocking lamps from tables, sending dust and plaster raining down. The very foundation seemed to give way beneath them. The sky outside tore open, not with rain, but with a torrent of crimson, a deluge that struck the roof with the sound of 1,000 drums beating a final, terrifying rhythm. Silas's hand plunged downward, and the house screamed with him, a sound that was both human and architectural. The sky bled. The air, every surface seemed to hum with a forgotten resonance, a low thrumming that threatened to unravel the fragile threads of sanity. The broken pattern of their lives, already fractured by generations of unspoken dread, now lay shattered beyond repair. The ritual of morning coffee, the creak of floorboards in predictable rhythm, the slow turning of pages in an old book, all held a new, grotesque significance. These were not just moments. They were ghosts of a normalcy that would never return, dissolving into the pervasive chill that permeated the very stones of the ancestral home. What was taken in the storm was more than flesh and blood. It was the very illusion of choice, the desperate hope that defiance could sever the ancient tether. Through the unearthed journals of Silas Carver, the progenitor of their misery, the terrible truth of the pact unfurled, raw and brutal. It was not merely for land, but for dominance over a power older than the valley, a power promised immortality for those who pledged its sustenance. The missing were not merely sacrifices. They were conduits, their essence feeding the ravenous core of a primordial entity, born of the earth's own pain and human avarice. This was the dark exclusivity of their family's inheritance, a burden passed down through tainted blood. A threatening curiosity now gnawed at the remaining carvers. With the answers came a greater terror, the chilling clarity of their ancestors' monstrous bargain. The rain of blood was not just a symbol, it was the active weeping of the earth, stained by the life force it devoured, a grim testament to the entity's insatiable hunger. It wasn't the sky bleeding, it was Cold Creek itself, its veins tapped, its ancient heart still beating with malevolent purpose. The old clock in the hall, which had long stood frozen at 3:15, now moved imperceptibly, not ticking, not chiming, but its hands shifted by a hair's breadth each dawn, then receded by dusk. This unsettling ambiguity hung in the air, a silent mockery of time's passage. Was it a sign of the entity's weakening grip, or a cruel promise of its slow, relentless return. The very concept of certainty had eroded, replaced by a dread that pulsed with the erratic beat of the house's unseen heart. The lingering scent of iron, the metallic tang that clung to every surface after the rain, was a constant shadow of risk. It spoke of unhealed wounds, not just on the land, but within the very lineage of the Carvers. Every breath drawn in that house tasted of consequence, of a future already written in crimson. They understood now why their predecessors had simply endured. To fight was to offer more. To resist was to invite a swifter, more agonizing consumption. They found a single, tarnished silver locket beneath the floorboards in the child's room, a fragile keepsake that had belonged to the youngest Carver. Inside, a miniature portrait, barely recognizable, but its eyes held an impossible depth, a knowing resignation that chilled them to the bone. This was the poisoned callback, the ghost of an innocence sacrificed, a mirror reflecting the inevitable fate that awaited their dwindling line. The portrait seemed to subtly shift in the flickering light of a dying lamp, its gaze following them, judging their every desperate, futile move. The stagnant water in the bird bath outside, untouched by the cleansing rain, shimmered with an unnatural sheen, reflecting a sky that remained perpetually bruised. The world beyond Cold Creek, it seemed, had begun to turn away, the radio in the living room emitting only a low static hiss, a constant white noise that drowned out any whisper of external solace. Animals, even the persistent mountain birds, had vanished from the valley, leaving behind an echoing silence, broken only by the creak of the old house settling into its deeper, more sinister repose. This was the progressive discomfort, the slow, agonizing realization that their world was shrinking, contracting around them like a tightening noose. They were not merely isolated. They were contained, trapped within the perimeter of the ancient pact, observers of their own slow erasure, the boundaries of their reality blurred, the familiar becoming alien, the air thick with an oppressive weight that never lifted, even when the sun managed to break through the perpetual gloom. A fleeting memory surfaced for one of the elder Carvers, a recurring dream from childhood, not of blood, but of a vast, empty expanse under a sky the color of ash, a whisper carried on a non-existent wind. It does not forget. This reversible omen, once dismissed as a childish nightmare, now unfolded as prophecy, a warning from the ancestral subconscious that the payment was never truly complete, only paused. The cycle was not broken. It had merely shifted its phase, waiting for the opportune moment to manifest anew. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum. The echoes of children's voices, once faint and distant, grew sharper, more immediate, yet there was no joy in them, only a hollow mimicry. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the dust motes dancing in the shafts of fading light, a ghostly choir singing of what had been lost. Each familiar sound now held a double meaning, a whisper of both present and past, blurring the lines of what was real and what was merely a spectral resonance. The ancient painting in the study, its oils cracked and faded, depicted a bleak landscape of their valley, with Cold Creek winding like a black serpent through skeletal trees. But now, it was as if the pigment itself had deepened, the shadows within the artwork growing richer, more ominous. The air around it felt colder, hinting at a portal, not just a depiction. This was the motif, returned with a vengeance, the canvas no longer just art, but a living, breathing testament to the horror that had been unleashed, a window into the hungry earth. The carvers understood now. The ancestors' act wasn't just greed. It was an attempt to harness an ancient power, to bend the very essence of the land to their will. But the power had a will of its own, and it had simply waited, collecting its due, generation by generation. The rain of blood was its harvest, the vanished its nourishment. The promise of immortality had been a cruel trick. It was the curse that was immortal, binding them to an endless cycle of dread and disappearance. There was no grand battle left to fight, no desperate escape route unseen. The only truth was the enduring hunger, the silent consumption. The documenting efforts, the paranormal investigations, had only served to illuminate the cage they were in, not to dismantle it. They were not breaking the chains. They were merely tracing their intricate, agonizing patterns across the floor of their prison. This was the final, devastating, broken pattern. The routine of hope replaced by the stark, unyielding reality of their fate. And as the last ember of defiance flickered and died within them, a new, more insidious form of terror took root. The understanding that this was not an external threat to be vanquished, but an internal, hereditary decay. The curse was in their blood, in the very marrow of their bones, passed down like an unwanted birthright. It meant that even if they fled, the hunger would follow, a shadow stitched to their lineage. The sense of emotional claustrophobia became absolute, pressing down from the low ceilings, radiating from the ancient stone foundations. Every breath felt shallow, every thought tainted by the pervasive dread. The house no longer just held their secrets, it was their secret, a living tomb where generations had slowly withered under the weight of an unpayable debt. A whisper seemed to ripple through the very air, not from human lips, but from the settling dust, from the shifting light on ancient wood. It spoke of awareness, of something beyond their comprehension, watching, waiting. If something in here moved what you don't name, subscribe to the hidden horror. The next story will find you first. The words were an insidious invitation, a recognition that the unseen had found a way to bridge the gap, to identify those who truly saw. The silence that followed was heavy with implication, a knowing hush. It confirmed that their desperate act of reaching out had not broken the curse, but merely broadened its reach, drawing more eyes to the slow, agonizing drama of their family's end. The cycle was unbreakable, the debt endless, and the cold creek flowed ever darker, carrying away not just water, but the echoes of every lost life, every vanished hope. The skeletal remains of the forgotten pioneer structures outside, once stark reminders of a bygone era, now seemed to twist and contort in the waning light, their jagged silhouettes appearing almost to writhe. They were not just ruins. They were bones, the very skeleton of the curse rising from the earth itself. The mournful call of a lone bird, once distant, now seemed to come from within the house, a chilling lament that spoke of inevitable loss, of a lineage slowly, agonizingly being erased. The mystery of Cold Creek was 70% revealed, the mechanics of its terror laid bare. The ancient sin was an usurpation, a violation so profound that the land itself had retaliated, birthing an entity that fed on the life force of the perpetrator's descendants. The payment was not finite, it was cyclical, an eternal harvest. The carvers were merely the crop, destined to be reaped. But 30% remained cloaked in shadow, a terrifying ambiguity. What did the consumed become? Did their consciousness linger within the entity, part of its terrible collective hunger? And if the last carver vanished, would the entity simply sleep? Or would it awaken to find new prey, its hunger spreading beyond the valley? The questions hung, unanswered, like cobwebs in the darkest corners of the mind. The last flickering light in the ancestral home cast long, dancing shadows, distorting familiar objects into monstrous shapes. The old portraits, their eyes fixed and vacant, seemed to watch with a newfound sentience, their painted visages holding the secrets of all who had come before and all who would never return. The creek flowed on. The darkness collected. No one remained. The silence that followed was not empty, but heavy with a presence that had finally shed its pretense. It was the sound of a closing door, not just on a room, but on a lineage. A final exhalation of all that had clung to the Carver name for centuries. The flickering gaslight in the main hall, once a reliable sentinel, now pulsed with a dying rhythm, as if its very flame were being slowly consumed by the gathering gloom, mirroring the last fragile beats of hope within those remaining walls. A chill, deeper than any winter draft, began to seep into the marrow of the few still breathing, a cold that spoke of ancient earth opening, not to swallow, but to dissolve. The scent of damp soil and something metallic, unmistakably blood, still clung to the air, interwoven now with the faint, sweet decay of forgotten flowers. It was the unique perfume of inevitability, a family exclusivity held close through generations of unspoken dread. The old pendulum clock in the parlor, long since silenced, now emitted a faint, intermittent tick, an unsettling ambiguity suggesting time had not stopped, but warped, each beat a step backward into the very moment of their ancestors' crime. No hands moved on its face, yet the rhythm persisted, a phantom pulse echoing from a past that refused to lie buried. Through the dust motes dancing in the dim light, the ancestral portraits on the wall seemed to deepen their shadows. Their eyes, once merely painted, now held a terrifying awareness. A subtle shift in the angle of a grandmother's head, an imperceptible tightening of a patriarch's jaw. These were not tricks of the light, but tiny, living alterations, a shadow of risk promising that the observers were becoming the observed. The stagnant water in the antique birdbath outside the parlor window, usually a dull mirror for the oppressive sky, began to ripple without wind, concentric rings expanding slowly, perfectly, as if something immense had descended into its depths. The dense sensoriality of this moment pressed in, the metallic tang on the tongue, the vibrating floorboards beneath their feet, the faint, high-pitched hum that seemed to resonate from within their own skulls. Then, from the upstairs nursery, a sound, faint but clear, the low, mournful hum of a forgotten lullaby. It was not an echo, for there was no source, but a direct whisper from the ether, a silence loop broken only by the spectral melody, an invitation to a horror no living being could comprehend. It was the sound of the youngest Carver, not gone, but absorbed. The worn wooden floorboards of the house, which had creaked predictably for generations underfoot, now groaned and shifted even when no one moved upon them. This broken pattern of their domestic peace, this deep structural lament, spoke of a foundation giving way, not just to time, but to something vast and hungry pulling from beneath. The very air itself thickened, becoming a viscous medium that resisted movement, each breath a struggle against a growing pressure. This progressive discomfort was not merely physical, it was a spiritual weight, a hereditary fear blooming into full, terrifying reality, the collective dread of centuries converging on this single, inescapable moment, a single desiccated rose petal, long preserved between the pages of an antique Bible, fluttered from its resting place and drifted slowly to the floor, landing precisely upon the faded image of a carved serpent on the hearth rug. It was a reversible omen, a sign that could be read as either a final surrender or a hidden pathway, but its true meaning remained veiled, a promise of revelation yet to be fulfilled. The faint scent of burnt sugar, a childhood memory of baking with a beloved, long-dead aunt, began to permeate the kitchen, clashing grotesquely with the lingering metallic tang. This poisoned callback to simpler times was a cruel mockery, a reminder of what was being irrevocably lost. Not just life, but the very essence of cherished memory, erased by the insatiable appetite of the land. The flickering gaslight in the main hall, now barely a spark, seemed to gather the remaining shadows, pulling them inward, creating a vortex of deepening blackness. It was a threatening curiosity, for it promised to swallow not just the light, but the very concept of visibility itself, leaving only the terror of the unseen. And then, a profound stillness descended, not the comfortable hush of a quiet night, but the complete, suffocating absence of all sound, all movement, all thought. It was the ultimate silence loop, a vacuum where the whispers of the earth seemed to deepen, no longer indistinct, but a low, guttural thrum beneath the floorboards. A sound not of settling timbers, but of slow, deliberate gnawing. Every surface, every shadow, held the imprint of what had been and what now wasn't. The old cradle, once merely an heirloom, now sat in the parlor, rocking imperceptibly in the stillness, a phantom breath disturbing its dust, a hollow space where the youngest carver once rested. This unsettling ambiguity clung to the air, thicker than any fog. Their ancestral dwelling, stripped bare of its former life, now felt less like a home and more like a tomb that breathed. The documentarians, the paranormal investigators, they had fled or vanished, their cameras abandoned, their data corrupted by an inexplicable magnetic surge that erased not just files, but memories of what they had witnessed. This broken pattern of seeking outside help had only confirmed the terrible, isolated truth. Some horrors refused to be documented, preferring to devour their witnesses. A subtle chill, an emotional claustrophobia, tightened around the chest of anyone who lingered too long in the Carver patriarch's study. The vast, empty shelves seemed to hum with the weight of unseen knowledge, the terrible truths they had tried so desperately to unearth from dusty journals, now merely an impression in the ether. The house itself, once a fortress against the world, was now a mirror of their inner decay, reflecting a deep-seated, hereditary fear that transcended generations. The only remaining Carver child, pale and quiet, would sometimes trace patterns on the frost-kissed window panes, patterns that disturbingly mimicked the ancient, forgotten symbols found etched into the cellar foundation. Was this an omen of enduring connection, or a reversible omen, a sign of a burden passed on, destined to repeat? The very air in the house was thick with the smell of old blood and damp earth, mixed with a faint, cloying sweetness, the scent of isolation. The clocks in the house, long since stopped or failing, now hummed intermittently, their hands twitching forward a single minute before falling back, a silence loop of time, refusing to march forward, trapped in a recurring nightmare. The old portraits on the walls, their eyes long faded, seemed to shift their gaze when one wasn't looking directly, their expressions contorting from stern resignation to something akin to profound, silent agony. This progressive discomfort was the new normal. They had found the truth, or a fragment of it. Not gold, but a vast, sacred territory had been seized, its ancient guardians violently displaced, their pact with the land broken by colonial greed. The rain of blood was not just a symbol, but a literal outpouring of the land's rage, a terrestrial retribution, demanding a life for every acre stolen, a drop for every tear shed. This family exclusivity, this specific memory of the house, was their terrible inheritance, the poison they had always drunk. The entity, the collector of this horrific debt, remained unseen, yet its presence was now undeniable. A cold breath on the nape of the neck, a distant, mournful cry that echoed from the very structure of the house. It was not a spirit, not a demon, but something far more ancient and entwined with the earth itself, a hunger rooted in desecration. Its shadow of risk stretched not just over them, but over the very concept of legacy. The carvers understood now that their frantic search for atonement, their desperate fight to break the chains, was less about ending the horror and more about enduring it, about acknowledging the sin that had been buried so deep it became the very foundation of their being. A rain of blood might have stopped for now, but the ground beneath Cold Creek was perpetually thirsty. If you made it this far without blowing out the candle, subscribe to the Hidden Horror. What comes next doesn't want to be seen alone. The faint, mournful call of the lone bird from the valley, once a symbol of quiet desolation, now seemed to carry a different weight, a poisoned callback to the initial stillness. It was the sound of an endless vigil, the lament of a land that remembers and that always collects. The cycle had been acknowledged, not broken. The remaining Carver children, now aware of their heritage, were left to face a life defined by an unpayable debt, a fate they could only carry, not relinquish. If something in here moved what you don't name, subscribe to the Hidden Horror. The next story will find you first. The earth, they knew, whispered still. The creek ran dark. The debt remained.